Ethan Carter whispered to himself, "I guess this will have to do," as he stared at the small portion of food left in front of him, a single sandwich and a bottle of water, knowing it was his last meal for the day and perhaps the only meal he would have before nightfall. The diner was quiet, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of a few early diners. Michael Reynolds, a man in his 40s with a clean-cut appearance, entered and sat down at a table across from Ethan. His eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on Ethan's nervous demeanor. Ethan hesitated, the choice weighing heavily on him, but after a moment of internal struggle, he pushed the plate toward Michael with a polite nod, his eyes wide yet resolute, conveying both the vulnerability of his situation and the courage it took to share what little he had. Michael looked at the offering with surprise, unsure of how to respond, his lips parting slightly as he grasped the plate with both hands. "You don't have to do this," he murmured, but Ethan shook his head, smiling faintly and gesturing with a small shrug, signaling that it was a decision made from the heart rather than obligation. The tension in the air was palpable yet gentle, each movement filled with unspoken understanding. The diner staff, particularly Sarah Bennett, a waitress wiping down the counter nearby, watched in silent amazement, noticing the selflessness in the young boy's eyes and the quiet dignity with which he acted. Michael lifted a bite of the sandwich to his mouth, the simple act of eating suddenly feeling profoundly significant, while Ethan sat back, folding his hands together on the table, his gaze unwavering, not seeking acknowledgement but fully aware that this gesture had transcended a simple exchange of food. The light from the morning sun streaming through the diner's windows highlighted the contrast between Michael's polished exterior and Ethan's modest appearance, reinforcing the gravity of the moment. A sense of anticipation lingered in the air as if the room itself held its breath, the subtle clink of dishes and distant conversations serving as background to a scene that would quietly ripple outward. What began as a small act of generosity between two strangers was poised to ignite a series of emotional reactions that would touch not only the people present in the diner but also the broader community. Ethan's eyes followed Michael carefully, ensuring that the gesture was received with respect and that the silent narrative of kindness was clear. A gentle smile crossed Michael's face as he met Ethan's gaze, silently acknowledging the weight of the gift and the courage behind it. The scene remained intimate yet charged with the potential to spread far beyond the diner walls, a moment captured in time that would quietly blossom into a story of selflessness and recognition, the warmth of shared humanity filling the small space. Every detail, the posture, the glances, the small hesitations, painted a vivid picture of a single act that carried immense emotional power and set the stage for the remarkable chain of events that was about to unfold. Ethan Carter watched quietly as Michael Reynolds took the first careful bite, the small diner suddenly feeling more alive with the invisible weight of human kindness and unspoken respect. Ethan's eyes shifted to the other patrons, noticing subtle glances and whispered murmurs as they sensed the unusual generosity in the air, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration, while the young boy's posture remained calm yet proud. His shoulders squared as he quietly observed the impact of his simple act. Sarah Bennett, the waitress, wiped her hands on a cloth, stealing glances at Ethan and Michael, her expression reflecting a mixture of surprise and warmth, the sunlight casting a soft glow across the room, highlighting the contrast between Ethan's modest clothing and Michael's tailored jacket, emphasizing the disparity in their daily lives but also the connection forged in that moment of sharing. Michael smiled faintly, raising his eyes to meet Ethan's, acknowledging the courage and thoughtfulness behind the gesture, a silent understanding passing between them, the hum of the diner now layered with an unspoken narrative of compassion. As Ethan recalled the hardships of his week, the empty stomachs, the cold nights, and yet found solace in the act of giving, Michael, chewing slowly, felt a deepening respect, his thoughts wandering to the significance of small acts and how they ripple outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. The faint aroma of brewed coffee mingled with the scent of the sandwich, grounding the moment in the tangible. While the emotional resonance soared, Ethan's mind raced with anticipation of the day ahead, wondering if this simple act could lead to more meaningful connections. As Michael set the plate down gently, their eyes locked, a bridge of mutual respect formed over a shared meal, the other patrons leaning slightly closer to catch fragments of the scene, the unspoken lesson clear that generosity and empathy transcend status, age, and appearance. Each glance, each subtle movement telling a story of courage and humanity, a quiet ripple beginning that would extend beyond the walls of the diner. Ethan's quiet composure and Michael's receptive acknowledgement creating a tableau of hope and possibility, the early morning light catching on Ethan's eyes, reflecting a mixture of humility and determination, while Michael's expression softened, realizing the profound impact of being treated with dignity, the air thick with promise, the diner becoming a small stage for a moment that, though fleeting, held the seeds of a story much larger than the immediate surroundings. Every detail, the gentle nods, the shared glances, the calm breathing, the subtle shift in posture, conveyed a narrative of connection and anticipation. The young boy's act of kindness quietly poised to set into motion a sequence of events that could inspire countless others, the scene imbued with anticipation, the invisible threads of human empathy stretching outward, hinting at the life-changing moments that were about to unfold, as Ethan continued to sit, watching, reflecting, and anticipating the unfolding day. His small but powerful act already beginning to resonate throughout the room when Ethan Carter stepped outside the diner, the crisp morning air brushing against his skin as he carried a quiet sense of purpose, his thoughts lingering on the interaction with Michael Reynolds and the ripple effect it had already begun to create. The streets of the city were just starting to stir, the hum of traffic and distant voices blending with the occasional chirp of a bird, and Ethan walked with measured steps, observing the world around him, noting the small struggles and quiet victories that often went unnoticed, the subtle ways people connected or ignored one another. His mind reflecting on how a single act of generosity could shift perceptions, spark recognition, and inspire unexpected kindness. While he approached the local park, he noticed a small group of children playing near the swings, their laughter light and genuine, contrasting sharply with the calculated seriousness of the business district he had passed moments before. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, grounding him in the present moment, and he found himself thinking about the larger implications of human connection, about how the day-to-day interactions, seemingly small and inconsequential, could form the foundation for more profound change. As he paused briefly to watch a young man struggle to carry a large bag of groceries up the park steps, Ethan instinctively offered a hand, the gesture simple yet impactful, eliciting a grateful smile that reinforced his belief in the power of compassion. Further down the path, an elderly woman fed pigeons, her slow movements deliberate and serene, reminding Ethan of patience and observation. He continued walking, noting the variety of people around him, some hurrying to appointments, some lingering in reflection, some engaged in quiet conversations, each contributing to the living mosaic of the city. Ethan's thoughts drifted to Michael, recalling the subtle nod of acknowledgement and respect, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them. He considered the weight of dignity and the importance of recognizing the humanity in others, regardless of status, and he felt a quiet determination to continue these small but meaningful acts, knowing they could accumulate into a larger narrative of change. As he moved toward a bench under a large oak tree, he noticed a man sitting alone, his posture tired yet dignified. Reflecting on Ethan's own past experiences of resilience, Ethan approached with a gentle smile and offered a seat, the man accepting with cautious gratitude, and in that moment, the shared humanity of strangers created a brief but powerful connection. Ethan felt the day opening before him with endless possibilities, each step a continuation of the lesson he had learned inside the diner, that empathy and attention to others' needs could quietly transform a community. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the park, Ethan's journey unfolded, a series of small interactions forming a tapestry of kindness, understanding, and anticipation for what would come next. The city alive with untold stories, each waiting to be touched by recognition and care, every glance, every smile, every shared moment reinforcing the truth that even the smallest gestures can spark meaningful change. And Ethan continued walking, fully present, fully aware, fully engaged with the world and its quiet miracles. You never know how a simple gesture can change everything, Sarah whispered to herself as she stepped out of the small cafe, the morning sun casting golden light over the bustling streets, her thoughts still lingering on the remarkable connection she had witnessed between the black investor and the millionaire earlier that day, a moment that revealed the power of recognition and respect. And as she walked down the crowded sidewalk, she observed people rushing to their destinations, the mixture of hurried steps and casual strolls creating a rhythm of city life. She adjusted her coat against the gentle breeze, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs and bring a sense of clarity, every passerby a reminder of the diverse tapestry of human experiences. and she thought about the ways in which simple acts, such as a shared smile or a helping hand, could ripple outward, influencing people and altering perceptions without anyone realizing it immediately. She passed a street musician strumming a soulful melody on his guitar, the notes intertwining with distant traffic sounds, the aroma of fresh coffee wafting from nearby shops blending with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. As Sarah turned into a quieter side street, she noticed a small gathering around a street performer, children laughing, adults pausing briefly from their routines, and she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that moments of attention and empathy were unfolding around her. She recalled the determined eyes of the black investor, Michael, and the respectful nod he had received, understanding that acknowledgement and human dignity were often overlooked in the rush of everyday life. And she found herself thinking about how each person she encountered, whether in a fleeting interaction or a prolonged conversation, could experience a shift in perspective simply through compassion and consideration. As she continued, she approached a local bookstore where she noticed Michael reading with intent, flipping through pages as if absorbing not just the words but the essence of knowledge and opportunity. She paused momentarily, appreciating the seriousness in his expression, recognizing that success and generosity were often interlinked, and the thought of how the millionaire had underestimated the value of respect and humility lingered in her mind. She stepped closer to a park entrance, observing the contrast between the quiet contemplation of individuals on benches and the energetic play of children chasing one another across the grassy area, the juxtaposition highlighting the spectrum of human emotion and activity in the city. She smiled at the thought that each interaction, no matter how small, contributed to a larger narrative of understanding and empathy. And as Sarah walked further, the sunlight reflecting off windows and glinting on car hoods, she felt a sense of continuity, a connection between her own observations and the unfolding story of Michael and the people around him, every encounter a brushstroke on the canvas of communal experience, reminding her that attentiveness, courtesy, and simple recognition could transform lives. And she resolved to carry these lessons forward in her day, observing, listening, and responding thoughtfully, fully aware that the smallest gestures often held the greatest power, and with each step she felt the threads of human connection weaving a pattern of unexpected generosity and understanding that extended far beyond the initial encounter, shaping perceptions and creating moments that could echo through lives in subtle yet meaningful ways. 1-2. It is amazing how a single act of kindness can ripple through an entire community, Sarah reflected as she walked past the bustling city park, the sunlight creating patterns on the pavement, and in that moment, she thought about how Michael, the young black boy, had selflessly shared his last meal with a stranger, a simple gesture that revealed his character and the quiet strength he carried. She observed the people around her, the mixture of hurried business professionals, parents guiding children, and elderly couples enjoying a slow stroll, and she realized that each person had their own story, their own moments of courage and empathy, and as she continued walking, she felt a renewed appreciation for how small, seemingly insignificant decisions could create profound consequences. She passed a food cart where the aroma of roasted nuts mingled with the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery, the sensory details grounding her in the present while her mind reflected on the ripple effects of Michael's generosity. She remembered the faces of the people who had witnessed his act, their expressions a mixture of surprise, admiration, and gratitude, showing that true human connection transcended social status, economic circumstance, and background. As she approached a bench near a fountain, she noticed children laughing, a dog bounding alongside its owner, and the interplay of light and water reminding her of the fluidity and interconnectedness of life's moments. She thought about how the stranger, initially a recipient of a humble meal, had shared Michael's story with others, spreading awareness and inspiring action, and Sarah felt a sense of hope, understanding that positive actions often multiplied beyond their immediate context. She paused to take a deep breath, inhaling the fresh morning air, and considered how she herself could carry forward the lessons of attentiveness, generosity, and recognition, small gestures that created large impacts. The way Michael's willingness to offer what little he had not only affected the stranger but created a cascade of goodwill throughout the city. She reflected on the expressions of awe and newfound respect that lingered on the faces of those who had heard of his generosity, proving that humanity responds to acts of kindness with acknowledgement and often mirrors those behaviors. Walking past a street musician playing an uplifting melody, Sarah noted how the rhythm of the city, like the rhythm of empathy, continued uninterrupted, each note, each interaction, weaving a tapestry of connected experiences. And as she moved along the street, the awareness of how Michael's small act had already changed perceptions and inspired conversations settled in her mind, reinforcing that the simplest choices, motivated by compassion and courage, held the power to alter the narratives around us and illuminate the potential for empathy in daily life. A realization that lingered, guiding her steps through the city with attentive eyes and a responsive heart, aware that every encounter presented an opportunity to continue the chain of human understanding and kindness. 1-2. As the morning sun filtered through the cafe windows, Sarah felt a quiet anticipation, knowing that the ripple of Michael's generosity from the previous day had already begun to influence the neighborhood. She observed the barista arranging pastries with meticulous care, each movement precise, almost meditative, yet the underlying tension of the day's unfolding events seemed to hum in the background. Michael, the young black boy, stood near the entrance, his modest backpack slung over one shoulder, the memory of sharing his last meal still fresh. He watched the diverse crowd with attentive eyes, noticing how people's interactions subtly reflected the small, yet profound, impact of his earlier act of kindness. The elderly man in the corner who had overheard the story from a passerby now nodded with quiet admiration. A young couple whispered excitedly while glancing toward Michael, their expressions reflecting a mixture of curiosity and inspiration. Sarah, noticing these small signs, felt a deepened understanding of how one act, though simple, could catalyze awareness and shift perceptions. She recalled how the stranger had retold Michael's story to several community members, creating a chain of influence that seemed to expand with each conversation. Outside, the city's morning energy played out with cyclists weaving between cars, delivery trucks arriving with goods, and the soft chatter of street performers. Yet within the cafe, a palpable sense of connection lingered. Michael approached a table where a family had been discussing recent news. His presence prompted a momentary pause, heads turned, smiles emerged, and Sarah noted the way subtle recognition and acknowledgement spread through these interactions. A quiet sense of admiration for courage and empathy took root, and as Michael sat to rest briefly, Sarah's mind wandered to how these seemingly minor gestures contributed to a larger narrative about human kindness. She imagined the chain reaction continuing throughout the city, strangers inspired to act with generosity, community members noticing and learning from the examples, and the invisible threads of human compassion weaving into everyday life. She also observed the subtle interplay of expressions and body language, the way a smile, a nod, or a brief eye contact carried meaning beyond words, signaling acknowledgement and validation, reinforcing Michael's impact and demonstrating that authentic acts of generosity, regardless of scale, have the power to transcend immediate circumstances and leave lasting impressions. Sarah felt gratitude for witnessing the unfolding human tapestry, recognizing that this moment exemplified the quiet strength of empathy, and how one individual's selfless actions could indeed transform the energy of an entire community. A lesson about attentiveness, kindness, and human connectivity that would resonate far beyond the walls of the cafe, shaping attitudes, inspiring action, and reminding everyone present that compassion, once initiated, spreads effortlessly through shared awareness and respectful acknowledgement, leaving a subtle yet powerful legacy of interconnected goodwill. 1-2. By midday, the city had fully awakened, and Sarah Bennett found herself moving through it with a heightened awareness of every small interaction, as if the invisible thread created by Michael's simple act of kindness had sharpened her perception of human behavior around her. She thought as she stepped out of the cafe again, watching people gather at street corners, enter shops, and exchange brief greetings that now seemed more meaningful than before. Michael Carter, the young black boy whose quiet generosity had sparked everything, was now seated on a bench just outside the cafe, observing the flow of people with calm attentiveness, his expression steady but reflective, as if he too was beginning to understand the widening impact of what had happened. Nearby, a man reading a newspaper paused mid-page after recognizing Michael from a conversation he had overheard earlier, his eyes softening with respect, while a woman walking her dog slowed down slightly, her attention drawn not by spectacle but by something deeper in the atmosphere. Sarah noticed how the story had already begun to take shape in fragments across the community, passed through whispered conversations, brief explanations, and emotional reactions that grew stronger with each retelling. Inside the cafe, the staff continued working, but even they seemed subtly influenced, their movements slightly more considerate, their voices quieter, As if the environment itself had absorbed the emotional weight of the moment, Michael remained unaware of the full extent of the ripple he had created, yet there was a quiet awareness in his posture, a sense that something beyond the ordinary had begun to unfold. Sarah approached the bench and sat a short distance away, not wanting to interrupt his thoughts, but observing him with a sense of admiration and curiosity. She reflected on how unusual it was for such a small action to alter the emotional tone of an entire morning, and yet here it was, spreading naturally without force or intention. A man nearby closed his laptop and stood up, walking past Michael and offering a brief nod of acknowledgement that carried more meaning than words. Another passerby slowed just enough to smile before continuing on, and these small gestures accumulated into a growing pattern of recognition that seemed to follow Michael wherever he went. Sarah realized that what she was witnessing was not simply a story being told, but a transformation in real time, one where empathy acted as the driving force behind human connection, reshaping how people saw one another in subtle but undeniable ways. The sunlight shifted as clouds moved overhead, casting soft shadows across the pavement, and in that changing light, Michael's presence seemed even more grounded, almost symbolic, as if he represented something larger than himself, a reminder of how generosity can quietly reshape the world around it. Sarah looked around once more and understood that the story was no longer confined to a single moment in a diner, but had expanded into a living narrative carried forward by every person who had been touched by it. And as the city continued its rhythm of motion and sound, the emotional resonance of that single, shared meal continued to grow, connecting strangers in ways none of them had anticipated, reinforcing the idea that even the smallest act of giving can become the beginning of something far greater than anyone could predict. The next morning, the sun rose over the city streets with a quiet brilliance that seemed to mirror the unfolding story of Michael Carter, the young black boy whose simple act of sharing his last meal had already begun to ripple through the community. Sarah Bennett, the compassionate onlooker who had witnessed his generosity, walked beside him as they navigated the sidewalks, her eyes scanning faces of passers-by, noting subtle nods and smiles, as if the city itself had become aware of the extraordinary smallness and greatness of his action. Every coffee shop and corner store along their route seemed to carry an invisible energy, the hushed murmur of recognition and admiration wrapping around them. Michael carried himself with a gentle confidence that belied his age, aware on some level that the act of giving had a power far beyond the moment. Sarah spoke softly about the ways people had been touched, how strangers had begun sharing their own kindness in unexpected ways, and Michael listened intently, absorbing the significance without ego. The rhythm of the city moved around them, yet each encounter seemed slowed, deliberate, almost sacred. A woman dropping change into a busker's cup glanced at Michael and smiled knowingly. An elderly man paused his morning walk to nod in acknowledgement, and a child tugged at a parent's hand, pointing toward him as if sensing something important. Together, Sarah and Michael entered a small park, the bench, where he had first eaten his meal now crowded with people offering small gestures of gratitude, a handshake, a pat on the shoulder, quiet words of appreciation. The scene felt alive with an unspoken understanding that one act of generosity could connect more than just two people. It could bind a community. Michael's gaze met Sarah's, a silent recognition passing between them that the story they were living was larger than any single individual. The air carried a sense of anticipation, as if everyone who had witnessed or heard of his action were subconsciously participating in this growing network of human connection. Each conversation, each glance, each subtle gesture added another layer to the expanding impact. Sarah felt a swell of hope, knowing that the smallest actions could catalyze significant change, and as they walked on, the city seemed to breathe along with them, carrying the memory of that one shared meal forward into every cafe, every shop, every street corner where someone might be inspired to act. In that unfolding urban tapestry, Michael's story became a living thread, weaving strangers together in empathy and understanding, a quiet testament to the profound effect of kindness. And as the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating faces and hearts alike, it became clear that the legacy of his action was no longer just a personal moment but a collective awareness spreading outward, shaping interactions, softening judgments, and inspiring new generosity. Across the city, the narrative of human connection and gratitude continued to grow, embracing Sarah, Michael, and everyone whose lives had been touched in ways small and large, the echoes of one meal transforming into countless acts of compassion, recognition, and shared humanity. When The city seemed to awaken with a quiet urgency as Michael Carter, the young black boy whose selfless actions had begun to ripple through the community, stepped onto the crowded sidewalk, Sarah Bennett walking closely beside him, their presence subtly shifting the energy around them. Every passerby seemed to notice, some offering nods, brief smiles, or a soft word of encouragement, the awareness of his generosity now creating an invisible thread connecting strangers. Michael's eyes scanned the morning crowd, absorbing the mix of curiosity, respect, and subtle admiration, understanding on an instinctive level that the impact of one simple act could echo far beyond the initial moment. Sarah commented quietly about how small gestures had a profound power, sharing anecdotes of similar kindness she had witnessed in the neighborhood. The two of them navigated a row of local shops, each interaction leaving a subtle mark, a cashier exchanging a grateful glance, a child pointing him out to a parent, the rhythm of the city's everyday life now punctuated with pauses of acknowledgement. As they approached a popular cafe, the hum of conversation shifted, heads turning slightly as patrons recognized Michael, whispers of his story spreading from table to table. He felt a gentle pride mingled with humility, the realization that his compassion had inspired a wider community. Sarah led him to a small park nearby where benches once overlooked by strangers now hosted impromptu moments of connection, people sharing small acts of kindness, dropping coins into someone's cup, offering seats, extending smiles, each gesture amplifying the narrative of empathy and human connection. Michael sat for a moment, watching the ripple effect, recognizing that one shared meal had become a catalyst for broader social awareness. The energy in the air was palpable, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared humanity. Flowing through the onlookers, Sarah noted how quickly positivity could spread, the scene becoming a living example of the tangible impact of giving. Michael's expression was contemplative, absorbing the subtle lessons of patience, observation, and quiet influence. Every glance, every small word of recognition further embedding his story into the collective consciousness of the city. As the day progressed, the city continued to hum with a sense of communal empathy, Michael and Sarah moving through streets, park paths, and corners where acts of kindness mirrored the original generosity, each encounter reinforcing the idea that a single selfless moment could grow into a movement, touching lives beyond immediate recognition, weaving a tapestry of human warmth, trust, and compassion. The narrative of his simple act now carried forward in countless subtle ways, connecting people, inspiring new kindness, and building a network of shared understanding and goodwill, a testament to the enduring power of generosity and the quiet impact one individual can have on an entire community. The city had begun to settle into the late afternoon rhythm when Michael Carter and Sarah Bennett reached the quieter edge of the downtown district, where the noise softened into distant traffic hum and scattered conversations, yet the emotional ripple of Michael's earlier act still lingered in subtle but undeniable ways. People they passed seemed slightly more attentive, more willing to acknowledge one another, as if something unseen had shifted collective awareness toward kindness and recognition. Michael walked with steady steps, his expression calm but thoughtful, noticing how strangers occasionally looked at him longer than usual, some with curiosity, others with quiet respect, while Sarah observed these reactions closely, recognizing how quickly a single act of generosity had evolved into a shared community narrative that now influenced behavior in real time. They paused near a small intersection where a street vendor was closing his cart, and without hesitation Michael stepped forward to help lift a folded table, the vendor offering a grateful nod that carried more weight than the simple task itself. Sarah smiled at the interaction, sensing how naturally Michael responded to the needs of others without seeking attention or validation. Continuing forward, they entered a residential street lined with modest buildings where children played on sidewalks and neighbors exchanged casual greetings, and in each encounter the presence of Michael seemed to spark subtle recognition, as though the story of his shared meal had already traveled ahead of him like a quiet current. A woman watering plants on her porch paused to watch them pass, her expression softening as she made eye contact with Michael and gave a small wave, while an elderly man sitting on a nearby bench adjusted his posture as if acknowledging someone of importance. Yet Michael remained grounded, his attention more focused on the people around him than on the attention he received. Sarah reflected on how rare it was to witness such organic spread of goodwill, where no announcements had been made and no formal recognition had been arranged. Yet the community itself was responding in real time to an emotional truth it collectively understood. as they reached a small community center where a few people had gathered for an afternoon event. Conversations briefly slowed as Michael entered the space, not out of tension but out of recognition, a quiet pause that felt more like respect than surprise. Sarah noticed how quickly that pause transformed into warmth as one person after another began to greet him, some mentioning they had heard fragments of his story, others simply expressing appreciation without needing detail. Michael acknowledged each interaction with humility, his presence steady and unassuming, while the energy of the room gradually shifted into a shared sense of connection that felt both spontaneous and meaningful. Sarah realized at that moment that the impact of Michael's gesture was no longer confined to memory or retelling, but had become an active force shaping behavior, perception, and interaction across the community, a living example of how empathy once initiated does not remain static, but continues to grow, influencing strangers to act with greater awareness of one another. And as the afternoon light softened through the windows of the community center, casting long gentle shadows across the floor, Michael stood quietly among the people whose lives he had unknowingly touched, his simple act of sharing a meal having expanded into something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. A quiet but powerful transformation of collective human awareness rooted in kindness and recognition. The late afternoon light stretched across the city as Michael Carter stood quietly near the entrance of the community center, surrounded by a growing number of people whose lives had been subtly touched by his simple act of sharing a meal. And as Sarah Bennett observed the scene from a few steps behind, she noticed how the atmosphere had shifted once again, no longer just curiosity or admiration, but something deeper, a collective recognition forming among strangers who now seemed connected by a shared emotional thread. Michael's presence remained calm and grounded, his posture relaxed but attentive as individuals approached him one by one, offering brief words of appreciation or silent nods that carried more meaning than any elaborate explanation. And though he responded with humility, it was clear that the weight of attention had begun to settle around him in a way that transformed the moment into something larger than either of them had anticipated. Sarah stepped closer and quietly reflected on how quickly human perception could evolve when empathy was introduced into everyday interactions, watching as a young woman from the community center explained to another group how she had heard fragments of Michael's story earlier in the day, each retelling adding another layer of emotional resonance that strengthened the collective understanding of his gesture. Nearby, a man who had initially passed by without noticing now returned, his expression softened as he extended a simple greeting, acknowledging Michael not as a stranger but as someone whose actions had already influenced his thinking. And this pattern continued as more people arrived or paused, drawn not by spectacle but by an intangible sense of shared humanity. While inside the community center, the energy shifted from casual gathering to something more reflective, conversations becoming quieter and more intentional, as though the presence of Michael had subtly altered the emotional tone of the environment itself. Sarah observed how even the staff seemed affected, their movements slower and more thoughtful, as if absorbing the significance of the unfolding moment. Michael eventually took a seat near a window where the fading sunlight illuminated his face, and for a brief moment he simply watched the flow of people around him, perhaps beginning to understand the scale of the ripple he had unknowingly created. Sarah joined him nearby, noting how his expression remained unchanged by the attention, still rooted in sincerity rather than expectation, and she considered how rare it was to witness such authenticity in a world where recognition often altered behavior. Yet here it only seemed to reinforce his quiet humility. Outside, the city continued its routine rhythm, cars passing, conversations rising and fading. But inside this small space there was a growing awareness that something meaningful had taken root, a reminder that human connection often begins with the smallest of gestures and expands in ways no one can fully predict. And as the evening approached, the gathering slowly transformed into a shared moment of reflection, where strangers who had once been separate now found themselves connected through the simple memory of a meal offered without hesitation, creating a living narrative of kindness that continued to spread far beyond the walls of the community center, carried forward by every person who had witnessed or heard it, shaping perceptions, softening judgments, and reinforcing the quiet truth that generosity has the power to reach farther than its origin ever intended. As evening began to settle over the city, the atmosphere inside the community center grew quieter, more reflective as Michael Carter, the young black boy whose simple act of sharing his last meal had now spread far beyond its origin, remained seated near the window with Sarah Bennett beside him, both observing how the space had transformed into something almost symbolic, a gathering no longer defined by routine but by shared awareness and emotional connection. The people around them no longer spoke in scattered fragments of conversation, but in softer, more thoughtful tones, as if the story they had all heard and retold had created an unspoken agreement to treat one another with greater care. And Michael, though still humble and composed, could sense the weight of what had grown from a single moment of generosity, his eyes moving across the room where individuals who had once been strangers now exchanged nods of recognition, their expressions carrying a quiet respect that had not existed before. Sarah leaned slightly forward, her voice low as she reflected on how rapidly the narrative had evolved throughout the day, from a private exchange in a diner to something that now seemed to live within the entire community. And as she spoke, she noticed how Michael remained unchanged by the attention, his posture steady, his demeanor grounded in sincerity rather than pride, a rare stillness that seemed to anchor the emotional energy around him. Outside the windows, the city lights began to flicker on one by one, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the deepening blue of the evening sky, and inside, small interactions continued to unfold as people approached Michael not with spectacle or exaggeration but with quiet acknowledgement, some offering simple thanks, others sharing how the story had influenced their day in small but meaningful ways, and each interaction added another layer to the growing sense that something larger than any one individual had taken shape. Sarah observed how even those who had initially been indifferent now seemed affected, their movements slower, their expressions softened, as if the memory of the shared meal had reached into their perspective and subtly shifted how they saw others around them. Michael eventually stood and walked slowly through the room, not as someone being celebrated but as someone still trying to understand the full scope of what had unfolded. And as he moved, people instinctively made space, not out of distance but out of respect, creating a natural path that reflected the quiet impact of his presence. Sarah followed at a slight distance, watching how the energy of the room adjusted with every step he took, and she realized that what she was witnessing was not a moment of fame or recognition in the traditional sense, but something more enduring, a collective awakening to the idea that kindness, once expressed without expectation, can reshape the emotional fabric of a community, binding strangers together through shared awareness and mutual reflection. And as the evening deepened and conversations softened into silence, the community center became a space filled with quiet understanding, where the memory of one shared meal continued to resonate, not as an isolated event but as an ongoing reminder that even the smallest act of generosity can expand far beyond its origin, touching lives in ways that cannot be measured but can only be felt in the way people choose to see and treat one another moving forward. The next morning, sunlight streamed gently through the large windows of the community center, casting long golden beams across the floor as Michael Carter, the young black boy whose simple act of generosity had already rippled through the town, stood quietly near the entrance with Sarah Bennett, both of them absorbing the evolving energy of the space, the air filled with the muted hum of conversation and the occasional laughter of those who had gathered not for spectacle but for reflection. As the story of Michael sharing his last meal had inspired a profound sense of unity among everyone present, he could feel the invisible threads of connection stretching across the room, linking strangers through empathy and shared recognition. Sarah noticed how the previously indifferent visitors now approached Michael with genuine smiles, expressing their gratitude not in grandiose gestures but in subtle nods, soft words, and moments of attentive listening. And Michael, though aware of the attention, remained modest, his posture calm and grounded, demonstrating that the impact of one small act could surpass the need for personal acknowledgement. He moved slowly through the room, allowing himself to witness the ripple effect firsthand, observing how a single decision to act with kindness had shifted the community's perception. Each person he passed seemed subtly transformed, the atmosphere carrying a sense of collective responsibility. Quiet understanding that small deeds could inspire lasting change, Sarah followed discreetly, noting how the dynamic between individuals had softened, tension replaced by mutual respect, and she realized that Michael's courage had created a living example of how generosity can influence behavior, encourage self-reflection, and foster deeper connections within society. Outside, the city's morning routine continued with its usual bustle, but inside, a gentle pause prevailed as people lingered longer, conversing thoughtfully, offering assistance to one another, and sharing stories of their own small acts of kindness, a chain of positive interactions emerging organically. Michael paused by a table where several community members were arranging donated items for local families, watching how his own actions had encouraged a broader sense of purpose, and he felt a quiet fulfillment not from recognition, but from seeing the tangible outcomes of shared humanity. Sarah spoke softly beside him, reflecting on how one choice, made with sincerity and compassion, had the power to elevate an entire community. And as the morning progressed, the energy in the room continued to swell, a living testament to the idea that even the simplest gesture of kindness can resonate far beyond its origin, leaving lasting impressions that inspire reflection, connection, and an ongoing commitment to empathy and generosity that would carry the spirit of Michael's actions into countless interactions. Beyond that moment, too,